The hail came in on the deep transit channel at 034, and I was the one sitting watch. 22 contacts had dropped out of fold transit on the night side, roughly 400,000 kilometers above the equatorial plane. No prior approach declaration, no corridor request, no identification ping on any standard frequency. Just the contacts appearing on the board like stones dropped into still water. And then the hail. Tight beam, aimed directly at the Varith array's primary uplink dish, with a precision that told me whoever was calling had known exactly where to point before they arrived. I logged the time, noted the bearing, and opened the channel. The voice that came back was not a voice in any biological sense. It was a structured carrier transmission, self-translating through the resonance architecture of the channel itself. Something our linguists had spent 40 years learning to read after the first deep archive surveys of the array's sub-basement gave us access to the original signal protocols. I understood it the way you understand your own handwriting. The Sorath continuance had come to collect their property. This station, the transmission said, is built on a sovereign navigational anchor of the continuance. You will cease operation and withdraw all personnel within one planetary rotation. Recovery teams will begin extraction at that time. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the board. 22 hulls. The largest was running about 800 meters bow to stern. I could tell, fold wake signature, which our sensors had been reading and cataloging for 3 decades, in preparation for exactly this class of arrival. I had been senior signals officer at Varith for 19 years. Before me, the post had been held by a woman named Alcara Ven for 26 years, and before her, a man named Dresh Solano for 31. The files went back further than that. The Varith array had been staffed continuously for 900 years. I keyed the transmit circuit. Continuance vessel. This is Senior Signals Officer Heron Voss, Varith Deep Broadcast Array, Earth. I've received your message. I'd like to make sure I understand your claim correctly before we proceed. Are you referring to the Sorath Kayan navigational anchor? Original construction date, approximately 30,000 years before present, buried at a depth of approximately 400 meters beneath the current array superstructure? The pause was about 3 seconds, long enough that I knew someone on the other end had not expected the question. That is correct. The transmission came back. You will have located it during your excavation of the site. It is sovereign property of the continuance and must be returned intact. I pulled up the archive file. It was one of the oldest documents in the array's record system, a survey notation, handwritten by a geologist named Pel Maris, dated to the early years of the third survey period, when the original excavation teams had first broken ground on what they thought was an unusual geological anomaly in the equatorial highlands. Ross's notation read, "Structure is artificial, material composition unknown, emitting low-amplitude carrier signal on a frequency we cannot yet source. Recommending further study." Further study had taken 1100 years. "Sir," I said, "I want to be straightforward with you, because I think there may be some confusion about the current state of the structure you're referring to. The Sorath Kayan anchor is not intact in the sense your recovery teams would be expecting. It hasn't been intact for approximately 22,000 years. Another pause, longer this time. Explain, so I explained. The original anchor had been, as best our engineers could reconstruct, a navigational and signal repeating structure, a deep space beacon designed to persist through geological time, broadcasting a carrier signal that a returning fleet could home in on from fold transit distance. Elegant engineering. The power core had been designed to run for 100,000 years on the thermal differential of the planet's own crust. Our ancestors had found it, realized within a few centuries that it was artificial, and spent the next several hundred years taking the outer casing apart one layer at a time. What they found inside was the carrier architecture. It was not a simple repeating signal. It was a structured protocol, a layered resonance system that could carry multiplex data streams on a single transmission without interference degradation over interstellar distances. Our communications engineers at the time had nothing like it. They had been working with line-of-sight relay systems, slow and lossy, and limited to planetary distances. The anchor's carrier architecture was something else entirely. They spent 400 years learning to read it. Then they spent another 400 years learning to build with it. The Verith Array, as it now stood, was not a building around a buried beacon. It was a planetary-scale communications and defense coordination network. 600 relay stations distributed across the equatorial band, 11 deep broadcast towers each 4 kilometers tall, and a primary uplink assembly embedded in the bedrock of the equatorial highlands, in the exact location of the original anchor, because the original anchor's power core was still running and still feeding the grid. We had not replaced it. We had wired into it the thermal differential power system that the continuance had designed to last 100,000 years was now the primary power source for the most critical communications infrastructure on the planet. The carrier architecture the anchor had originally used to broadcast a simple homing signal was now the underlying protocol for Earth's entire planetary defense coordination network. Every orbital battery, every approach corridor sensor array, every deep transit detection system from the inner belt to the fold transit threshold. All of them spoke to each other through a descendant of the Soroth-Kayan carrier signal. We had not merely preserved the anchor. We had grown an entire civilization's nervous system out of it. I told the continuance all of this, plainly, without editorializing, the way you tell someone the weather. The silence after I finished was the longest yet. When the transmission came back, it was a different voice, or a different structured pattern that I interpreted as a different authority level. Higher, by the formality markers in the resonance encoding. You are stating that the anchor's architecture has been integrated into critical planetary infrastructure. That's correct. And that removal or shutdown of the anchor would require a complete rebuild of the planetary defense coordination grid from the ground up, I said. The carrier protocol is not separable from the network at this point. It's been the foundation layer for 11,000 years. Everything we've built since is written in that language. I watched the board while I waited. The 22 contacts had not moved. Few of the smaller hulls had shifted bearing slightly. Nothing that read as an attack posture, more like the involuntary movement of a group of people who had just heard something unexpected and had turned to look at each other. On the surface below the array, I knew the defense grid was fully awake. It had been awake since the fold transit signatures appeared on the board at 0337. The approach corridor sensor net was painting all 22 contacts in real time, ranging and tracking with an accuracy that would have been apparent to any signals officer reading the carrier bleed. Continuance could see that we could see them. They could also see because our broadcast towers had not stopped transmitting for a single second. Since the hail came in, that shutting this array down was not a quiet operation. It would be visible across the inner system. It would be noticed. Is your proposal, the transmission said at last. I had the document ready. It had been drafted 40 years ago by the legal division of the Planetary Communications Authority, updated 3 times since, and sitting in a folder on my secondary console, labeled Soroth Contingency. I was not the first signals officer to have been briefed on the possibility of this conversation. I was not even the third. We're prepared to offer a formal record of original construction, I said. The archive here carries 900 years of documented survey and engineering work, all of it citing the anchor as the foundational structure. We'll provide a certified copy. Your engineers can verify the original construction signatures against whatever records you carry. The continuance's claim of original authorship will be acknowledged in perpetuity in the array's operational charter. And in return, the continuance acknowledges 30,000 years of continuous, good faith use and improvement. The anchor was not abandoned with a caretaker in place. It was left on an inhabited world with no instruction and no contact. We found it, studied it, and built with it. That's what we do. The silence this time was different. Not the silence of confusion, or of people turning to look at each other. The silence of a calculation being completed. The record will reflect, the transmission said carefully, that the anchor remains in operational use. It will reflect that the anchor has been in continuous operational use for approximately 22,000 years, I said, and that it is currently supporting critical planetary infrastructure. Yes. Another pause. We will consider your offer. They considered it for 6 hours. At 0941, the senior transmission resumed, confirmed acceptance of the licensing record, and requested a data transfer protocol for the certified archive copy. I ran the transfer myself, using the array's primary uplink, in other words, a broadcast system built on the protocols the continuants had originally designed, carrying their own engineering archive back to them, in a signal their own ancestors had invented. By 1200, the 22 contacts had begun full transit prep. By 1340, they were gone. I sat at the board for a while after the last contact dropped off the scope. The equatorial sun was coming through the reinforced glass of the watchroom, catching the dust that always hung in the air, this high up in the array tower, making it look like something almost ceremonial. Down below, 600 relay stations were doing what they had always done. The carrier signal that had been broadcasting from this location for 30,000 years was still broadcasting. I logged the contact, the exchange, the transfer, and the departure. I noted the continuance's hull count and transit bearing for the Defense Archive. I noted that the Sorath contingency file had been used and could now be marked resolved, pending any future return visit, which I considered unlikely. Then I wrote one more line in the log because it seemed worth writing. They built it to call them home. We found it, and we answered. And we kept answering for 30,000 years. When they finally came to collect, there was nothing left to collect, only what we'd made of it and what we'd become. I signed the entry, handed off the watch, and went to get breakfast. The array kept broadcasting. It always did.